As dawn began to illuminate the horizon with its first light, the outer neighborhoods of the large city still bore the fatigue of the night. Streetlights cast a faint glow onto the asphalt, and the empty back streets lay silent, as though covered by a veil of fog. People had yet to wake. The curtains in the windows of houses were only just being drawn aside. At this hour, even in the city center, life had not fully sprung to action, whereas in the outskirts, the streets seemed almost ghostly in appearance. In one of these neighborhoods, an officer named Ethan was finishing up his night patrol. Ethan was a relatively young police officer. It had only been a few years since he started the job. Even so, he had grown accustomed to patrolling the area. He knew most street corners, the less busy roads, and the unfamiliar back alleys step by step. Each time the sun rose, he sometimes encountered unpleasant incidents, sometimes unforgettable stories. And on this particular morning, a feeling inside him whispered that something different might happen. He slowed his pace, letting his gaze sweep the side streets. In an alley lined with garbage containers and cast into dark shadows near the walls, there could be homeless people curled up among cardboard boxes or sacks. In this big city, most who slept on the streets were strangers to its inhabitants. During the silent hours when no one paid attention, they were largely left to their own fate. On each patrol, Ethan would at least talk to a couple of them, try to understand their situation, sometimes offering a little help. But the sight he witnessed that morning pierced his heart more as a human being than as an officer. At the edge of the sidewalk, in a narrow gap between two buildings, it appeared that a black child was sleeping. He was wearing almost nothing, a thin t-shirt, maybe some torn pants. It was clear that he lacked a blanket or extra clothing, despite the cold. The boy had curled himself up, perhaps hoping to stay a bit warmer by leaning against the wall and on a couple of cardboard pieces he had gathered from the ground. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off him. Even though it wasn't yet daybreak, seeing one so young sleeping out in the street tore at his heart. The boy's facial expression, one of blankness, hinted at an uneasy slumber. His brow was slightly furrowed as though he were dreaming. Who knew how long he'd been there? Had he spent the night like this? Ethan approached quietly. There was a slight static from the police radio. Headquarters might be checking on his location. But at that moment, Ethan's entire focus was on the child. As he got closer, he estimated the child to be about 14 or 15. In his eyes, the boy was still a child, unprotected and alone. A strong urge to protect him rose within Ethan. He knelt down but thought carefully about how to approach the boy without startling him. Most people living on the streets, when abruptly woken, could be afraid or panic. He didn't want to scare him unintentionally. He took a quick look around. On the far side of the street, a few people were getting ready for work, but no one seemed concerned about the boy. In big cities, seeing someone sleeping on the sidewalk, unfortunately, doesn't surprise anyone. But this was a child. Ethan silently wondered, who knows what made him end up here? Had he run away from home? Did he have no family? Or had he left to avoid getting involved in crime? Possibilities gnawed at his mind. Slowly he opened the zipper of his jacket. He wanted to remove it and lay it over the child, but first he decided he should gently touch him without startling him. He softly tapped the boy on the shoulder. "Hey, kid," he said quietly. "You're cold. Are you okay?" The child didn't respond at first. Ethan repeated himself a bit louder. This time the boy stirred a little, his eyelids partly opened. With wide, anxious eyes, he looked at Ethan. In that moment, Ethan saw both fear and vulnerability in those eyes. "Hello," Ethan whispered gently. "Don't be scared. I won't harm you. I'm a police officer. I saw you sleeping on the ground and I think you're cold." The child didn't answer. He only glanced away with apprehension. His body shifted as though he wanted to pull back. Ethan recognized this as a typical reaction. Anyone living on the street might be uneasy when confronted by an officer or a stranger. Still, he had to help the boy relax. Removing his jacket, he lightly placed it over the child. "Here, warm up a bit." The black child raised his gaze from the jacket to Ethan. His movement seemed slightly disoriented, maybe from sleep, maybe from the cold. His lips were chapped, his hands trembling. "Would you like to stand up and maybe we can get something hot to drink?" Ethan asked. There was still no reply, but at least the boy's eyes no longer showed intense fear. He only looked extremely tired and helpless. When the radio called him again, Ethan quickly responded, "This is Ethan. I have a situation here that needs my attention. I'll provide details soon." A strange excitement gripped him. Was this just another ordinary case of a homeless person, or was there a much sadder story behind it? Gently, he tapped the boy's shoulder once more. "Let's stand up step by step, all right? I'll help you." The boy rose a little. Probably he hadn't eaten properly for days and was suffering from lying on hard ground. Seeing the faint hint of pain on the boy's dark face, Ethan thought, "I need to be gentle." Inside, he was telling himself, "We can go somewhere together, maybe find a cafe for tea or hot soup." He still didn't know the boy's name, but who he was or why he was here, he'd need to earn his trust before finding out. As the boy stood, the jacket slipped off. Ethan bent down, picked it up, and more firmly wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. "I can't leave you like this. I promise nobody will hurt you, and I won't either," he said. The boy bowed his head, letting out a quiet moan, but didn't speak. Maybe he didn't have the strength to talk, or perhaps after everything he'd been through, he couldn't trust anyone. Meanwhile, Ethan's heart filled with curiosity and compassion. He wanted to learn the truth of what the boy had gone through and find a solution. By now, the streets would soon awaken as the sun rose higher. People would head to their jobs, schools, or daily routines. This boy, if unnoticed, might have simply disappeared on a sidewalk corner. But Ethan's finding him opened a new page in this story. Although events were just beginning, it was clear that a deeply affecting truth lay hidden, one that would move both the officer and those around them. And before long, when Ethan discovered this truth, it would bring him, as he would later say, to the brink of tears. Yet he didn't know that at this moment. For now, helping the boy find a safe place, a warm meal, maybe a small smile, these were his top priorities. Ethan escorted the black youth slowly through the streets, his concern turning into resolve. Rather than taking broad avenues, he chose narrow back roads so as not to alarm the boy with crowds or sudden stares. He firmly adjusted the jacket around the boy's shoulders and said, "Soon we'll find a quiet cafe for some soup or tea." The boy didn't speak, his eyes scanning the surroundings as though expecting danger at every turn. Ethan recognized his apprehensive body language. He avoided grabbing the boy's arm, refraining from guiding him physically, simply walking beside him with a slight distance. Sometimes the boy seemed inclined to hurry, other times he halted timidly. Ethan could only guess at what might be racing through the youth's mind. Life in these streets was tough enough, but maybe the reality behind his situation was heavier than Ethan imagined. They turned a corner and spotted a small cafe that had just opened for the morning. A sign on the window read, "Fresh croissants," and inside were a few tables, scarcely occupied. "Let's sit there. It looks quiet," Ethan said, pushing open the door. For an instant the boy hesitated, looking fearful. Ethan softly reassured him, "Take it easy. Nobody will harm you here. You're safe." Inside, the cafe's owner, a woman still showing signs of drowsiness, greeted them with a smile. Ethan guided the boy to a table far from the windows. He didn't want passing crowds outside to make him nervous. They sat at a small two-chair table in a quiet corner. Even after sitting, the boy was still draped in the jacket. His thin t-shirt, worn out, was even more apparent. His hands gripped the table's edge tightly, as though ready to flee at any moment. Glancing at the menu, Ethan asked, "What would you like? Soup, tea, maybe hot cocoa?" The boy's eyes flashed briefly, yet he didn't speak. Taking that as an assent, Ethan ordered 2 bowls of soup and 2 teas when the cafe owner approached. She wiped the table, gave the black child a quick glance, and then whispered something like, "Hope we can treat you well," to Ethan before leaving. He nodded slightly in thanks. Neither spoke until the soup arrived. Ethan was full of questions. "What's your name? Where are you from? Your family?" But he knew the boy needed some comfort first. Eventually, Ethan couldn't help but break the silence gently. "Look, I'm Ethan. You can trust that nobody will hurt you. We can eat together, and if you'd like to talk about anything, I'll listen." Hearing these words, the boy flicked his gaze at Ethan for a moment, then looked away again. His lips trembled. Whether from cold or emotion, it was hard to say. When the orders came, Ethan slid the soup toward the boy with a smile. "Go ahead. Eat. You must be hungry." The boy timidly took the spoon, but as soon as he caught the aroma, he began to eat bit by bit. In those first spoonfuls, Ethan saw how the boy's eyes lit up. Surely he was starving. They didn't speak for a while. Perhaps this was the first hot meal the boy had eaten in a long time. Sipping his tea, Ethan noticed a couple more customers quietly watching. Some had curious expressions, possibly pondering, "I wonder what that kid's story is," or "He must have gone through something." Ethan worried that these stares might make the boy anxious, so he tried to hold his attention on their table. "I haven't been an officer for very long," he said softly, "but I've seen enough to know everyone has a story. If you ever feel like sharing, I'd be glad to listen. If not, that's okay too." The boy briefly lifted his head, opening his mouth as if wanting to speak, but then stopped himself. That's when Ethan noticed a faint scar on the left side of the boy's neck, buried under dirt, dust, and general wear. His heart twinged. "I can't imagine what he's been through," Ethan thought. After finishing the meal, the boy left nothing in the bowl, seeming calmer now that his hunger was somewhat satisfied. Again, Ethan asked gently, "Could I learn your name?" This time the boy whispered, "My name's Jackson," in a voice so frail that Ethan fully grasped his vulnerability. "Pleased to meet you, Jackson," he replied. "So, you live on the streets? You have no family?" Immediately Jackson shuddered, averting his gaze. Maybe the questions frightened him. Maybe they stirred painful memories. Swiftly, Ethan apologized. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to upset you. I just want to help. If there's something bothering you, just say so." After a few seconds' silence, Jackson managed a shaky, "I don't know. I've been on the streets for a long time. Sometimes I try shelters, but they're always too crowded." His voice trembled and breath came in shallow bursts. "I have no family, or if I did, I don't remember them. I know no one in this city." Ethan paused, realizing Jackson was most likely entirely alone, perhaps with a history in an orphanage or traumatic events in his past. "So there's no one else? No friend or relative?" Jackson again shook his head, staring at the empty soup bowl. Just then the cafe owner approached to ask, "Do you need anything else?" Ethan politely thanked her, saying they were fine. As she left, Jackson's timid expression persisted, as though so much attention unsettled him. "Jackson," Ethan spoke again, "after this I'm considering taking you to the station or maybe contacting a shelter. But first, I want to hear your thoughts. Legally, we need to find a solution so you're not out on the street. I want to protect you, do you understand?" Jackson's eyes filled with anxiety. I don't want that," he mumbled. "They took me to a place before and I ran away. I don't like those places. Likely he was referring to a community house, a shelter, or a social service organization. Often these institutions were overcrowded or impersonal, making children uncomfortable. Ethan found himself at a crossroads. By protocol, he should escort Jackson to the station and initiate official proceedings. But seeing Jackson's reaction, he worried the boy might flee again. He seemed clearly traumatized. "Look," Ethan said once more, "how about we go to the station together? There's a child protective unit there. Maybe they can find you a better place. We can deal with this together. I promise I'll be there for you." Jackson was silent for a moment, tracing his fingers along the tabletop. Then, in a faint voice, "Okay," he said. There was still hesitation in his eyes, but it seemed he was starting to trust Ethan's goodwill. That small acceptance filled Ethan's heart with a wave of relief. "Great," he replied. "So let's finish our meal and then go to the station, all right?" Jackson remained silent but gave a slight nod, the assent Ethan had hoped for. The cafe wasn't yet crowded, but more customers had trickled in. Observing them, Ethan sensed curious looks from some. He understood their unspoken questions. Who is this officer and the kid with him? Why are they here? Maybe some were guessing their story. Others just minded their own business. After sipping their tea and tidying up the table, Ethan went to the cashier to pay. He then turned to Jackson. "Ready?" The boy rose silently, clutching Ethan's jacket more tightly. Stepping through the doorway, they found the sun had climbed higher. The streets were buzzing with people heading to work, and traffic was picking up. Even amidst the crowd, Ethan stayed close to protect Jackson. "It's going to be a long day," he thought. "But I need to learn this kid's story and help him." He couldn't predict exactly what they might discover, but a strong hunch told him that whatever he learned would stir his heart. Possibly Jackson's story was sadder or more unexpected than he anticipated. Still, there was no turning back. Every moment Jackson remained alone on the streets risked pushing him deeper into darkness. So now, in the cool morning air, merged into the city crowd, these two, a police officer and a boy who had slept on the street, moved forward in search of a truth that might prove deeply unsettling. Ethan felt sure that by the end of this journey, something would change for both himself and Jackson. And all he hoped was that Jackson would never again vanish onto the streets. When they arrived at the police station, Ethan introduced Jackson to the Protective Services Unit. In a warm office, around a table sat a young staff member and a social worker. At first, Jackson said nothing, head bowed, silent. But Ethan didn't leave his side, gently resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, conveying, "You're safe." Minutes passed, and Jackson slowly began to utter a few words. His story weighed heavily on everyone who listened. He lost his mother to an illness at a young age, and his father had left the city. Later, Jackson was placed with a relative, but endured maltreatment there. He had chosen to run away, preferring the streets over a distressing home environment. The scars he carried on his small body and spirit were too heavy for a 14 or 15-year-old to bear. As he spoke, his voice trembled, and the sorrow in his eyes deeply moved those present. Ethan felt a lump in his throat after each sentence, struggling to hold back tears. Finally, Jackson murmured, "I've got nobody, but I'm tired of running." Those words froze everyone in the room. Ethan realized tears were rolling down his cheeks. As a police officer, he had witnessed countless situations, but seeing such utter loneliness in one so young wounded him profoundly. The social worker intervened. "We can help you now, Jackson. You'll be safe here, and until a family takes you in, you'll be under the care of our institution." A tiny spark of hope flickered across Jackson's face, a sight Ethan would never forget. The officer squeezed the boy's hand gently. "I'll come visit you, and if you want, "I'll do everything I can so you can continue your education," he promised. At that, Jackson showed the first hint of a smile, sad perhaps, but carrying a soft glow nonetheless. By the end of that day, as Ethan stepped out of the station, his heart felt different. This patrol had led him not just to a child sleeping in the street, but also to a sense of personal responsibility for that life. Wiping away his tears, he thought, "Creating a world where a child can be safe may be the most important part of my job." And in that thought lay a lesson in humanity he would remember for a long time.